IVT's Validation Week returns in person this October, and it'll also be held virtually. This is the gold standard event for quality and validation professionals. Prepare to zero in on proven strategies for achieving regulatory compliance and educational training with top industry experts to ensure quality across the life sciences. Taking place in a hybrid format, in person October 19th to 21st in Philadelphia, and virtually October 26th to 28th. You'll have your top concerns addressed by key opinion leaders and benefit from benchmarking and knowledge sharing on the most critical topics in process validation, computer system validation, cleaning validation, equipment qualification, data integrity, and much more. This uniquely formatted event provides opportunity for all to gain the necessary training and discuss the most crucial topics in validation today. Plus, you can earn GMP training hours while attending. Validation Week 2021 is an event you cannot afford to miss. Visit informaconnect.com/ValWeek for full details on the agenda, registration, and team rates.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we're talking about risk-based critical thinking approaches to computer, software, and systems validation. And by now, most industry folks have heard about CSA and understand the basics behind the shift in priorities. What's better left to understand is the ifs and hows around adoption and implementation within our own organizations. A risk-based approach is nothing new. However, the evolution centers on a risk-based approach using critical thinking with focus on assurance needs, testing activities for our higher risk activities. So today we'll explore critical thinking in the systems validation department and share concepts and case history with our guest, Ken Shitamoto. Ken, it's great to have you with us today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure, as always.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure when we get to work with you. So Ken, to kick us off today, and for the purposes of this discussion, can you describe critical thinking as it applies to systems validation and risk-based methodologies?
Yeah, critical thinking, it comes back down to understanding principles versus practices. And my favorite quote in this area right now is, I think it's Harrington Emerson. I think he was born in 1850 or so. And it's the man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. And then the man who tries methods, ignoring principles, is sure to have problems or trouble. And there it's coming down to the critical thinking is really understanding the principles. Why do we test? Right? We don't test to create the documentation stack for inspection.
Right.
We test to ensure public health by ensuring product quality, right? Data integrity, patient safety, that trinity. So when you apply critical thinking, it's taking a step back, right? Because it is such a broad. It's like defining what is quality. You know what it is when you see it, but it's hard to kind of put all the parameters down.
Right.
Critical thinking is the same, but if you really focus on principles versus practices, and you understand why you do the activities in the validation cycle, right? You'll understand that CSA, CSV, two sides of the same coin. That you understand that everything in CSA is currently enabled by regulation. And It's actually nothing new, which is in some ways disappointing because, we've already said it before.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
It's in the branding.
Right. No, I agree. And I think, a lot of people were getting hung up on this thinking it's new guidances, but it's really not. It's just asking people to shift the way they think about things and the priorities within their organization. And since we're talking about guidances, the current FDA regulations on computer systems, which is 21 CFR Part 11, was issued back in 1997, and that's really gone unchanged since that point in time. And the FDA did release the guidance, General Principles of Software Validation in 2002, and then guidance on Part 11 in 2003. But as we all know, software development and testing methodologies have evolved significantly since then. So now we're talking about a potential new guidance. Why is this such a big deal then if it's not really a change in practices?
Yeah, it's because the people, again, going back to principles versus practices or methods, right? People haven't applied it. People look at GAMP and they say, like, I apply GAMP. What they do is they go to section M3 and they pull the table to 3x3 tables. And they say, like, hey, let me cross severity with probability. Let me get a number and then cross that with detectability. And that will determine what I do. And they shut off their brain. And that's the only section of GAMP they read. They don't read the section that says, like, hey, you should only use screenshots. If they're not going to add value, don't do them. Right? Unnecessary screenshots should be avoided. If they don't read the section on efficiencies enablers that talk about leveraging activities that were already done, that's when they start applying like a method out of context. So if you look at this, back to the first thing, everything has already been said. If you look at Part 11, you actually read the preamble, you'll understand where they were going. And there's this one point around, I think it's about 63 or so, and it's talking about the economic, a transaction versus an open system and a closed system. And like, hey, one is like, like I think like at $1 for an open system, and like versus something that was more expensive for a closed system. And so like, hey, for an open system, you have more control. And, but this has less of a financial. But, the agency was going like, within Part 11, you have the flexibility to adjust the stringency and extent of controls by any factor you choose, including financial. Right. So then the agency is even back then saying like, hey, you need to determine what works for you. And when you start going to CSA, it's really about doing what works for you to ensure that you can trust the application. And the compliance is a byproduct. The compliance isn't the goal, right? So, but we've created all these rituals around it. So it is a big deal in the sense that it's a nice area that is actually putting the emphasis and focusing people to think about critical thinking. And at the largest scale in CSA, which always fascinates me, people are like, well, the guidance hasn't come out yet, so it can't be compliant. I'm like, okay, but let's think about that. At one end, you can do stacks and stacks of documentation. And it's never ending, right? You're screenshot everything to death, and that's compliant. At the other end, you can say like, hey, this is a good vendor. It's a software as a service. It's Microsoft. It's Viva. I'm going to risk assess, 99% of the way. I'm just going to do a light PQ, a light UAT. That's compliant. Mm-hmm. This is in the middle. And, people are going like, well, I don't know if we could do it yet. I was like, well, wait a second. It's right smack in the middle of two compliant extremes. It is already, as Cisco, Vicente, the first time I said it, it's like, nothing outside of current regulation. It's a matter of clarifying misperceptions.
So do you think people just don't understand what's being asked of them? Is that what it is? It's a lack of understanding? It seems when, and we've talked about this before. This, like I said, this is not a new topic. So I'm wondering why people are still getting hung up on this.
It's where they, again, principles versus methods. I'll keep going back down to that. So if you look at, it's easy to do what you've always done. It's very easy to do what you've always done, and it's comfortable. You've done it. You don't have to necessarily explain it away. But that's in the point where we haven't actually kind of moved forward. Mm-hmm. And so our industry is stuck. If you look at general principles of software validation, the underpinning software engineering practices, if you average them, the references, it's 1993. Right. So you're looking at software engineering practices from a period in time where, it goes back to that, right? Statins didn't exist. AIDS was still a death sentence, right? We were just using VCRs, things that people probably don't even know what it is anymore.
We know.
Probably, yes. but on the flip side, it's a good that we know.
Right.
But it is this thing, and you know, my running hypothesis there is you move from validation, you go to quality. And when you're quality, it's easy to say, do what I always did. And we've put ourselves in this loop in the validation space. If you look at other parts where quality does their activity, right, they don't tell, like, say, the process scientist how to, you know, build their process. They
Right.
don't tell the biostatistician, like, well, I don't think your randomization algorithm's wrong. You should do a little bit more, right? Yet in our space, for some reason, there is this need where, in addition to process assurance, they're saying you will do it this way. And we've created this machine that's preventing the innovation because it's stuck in a loop. You move from quality, you know, from validation to quality, and you enforce it. And we've really stifled. And the interesting thing is people accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And they suffer through it. And the paradigm shift and the critical thinking aspect, again, could be like, if you understand the principles, you could say, well, why does it have to be this way?
Right.
You can start asking the questions. If you look at the underpinnings, another practice, right? If you look at where they say pass fail is unacceptable, that's just a judgment. But if you go back and you look, like, you know, to, like, say, computerized systems used in drug inspection, I think that's 83 or 84. And that one is the one where, you know, it's cited as like the source because it said, like, hey, you can't just say that the printer passed or failed because the printer's got attributes like speed, quality, you know, number of lines inputting into it, right? And everyone's like, see, you can't do pass fail. But what it's saying is you can't do pass fail that the printer's okay. You have to say that the printer's speed is okay, pass fail. But the quality is okay, pass fail, right? Same thing with screenshots. I always have this fascinating conversation with people. It's like, show me where it's written that I must have a screenshot. Right? Because I only know of one that comes to mind when I start thinking about it, and that's like computerized systems used for blood inspections. But in fact, that, you know, that software, you know, blood banking software, it's actually considered a medical device. So it's considered product, right? And we're talking about everything that's non-product, right? And so, okay, yeah, if it's product, then there's that standing thing like, hey, you got design control, and there's a whole extra level of rigor that's expected.
Sure.
But we're talking about the computerized system. And the last one I want to bring up, why is this such a big deal? Because this is the first opportunity where we're really having, and we're kind of changing. If you go back, again, I like to go back to the past because it's all about the principles, understanding how we got here. You look at PDA, I think it's TR15. And this is like, you know, one of the early documents where they're talking about what computerized systems validation should look at. The analogy was process validation. So we're talking about, you know, orders of magnitude difference in complexity, right? You're talking about like I think the Debian, you know, Linux is like maybe 39 million lines of code in it. You know, Photoshop and those things have like 10 million lines of code. You're going to compare something that's measured in millions to a process, which is going to have, you know, critical parameters. You're not even close. And yet you're saying like, okay, this is the reference model that I'm going to use for something that's way more complex. That's now actually pushing the limits of what a human can comprehend.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. I mean, you know, it's hard to make sense out of that. So Ken, let's talk a little bit more about the critical thinking approach. And if you can talk about, you know, what types of critical thinking should be used when developing your risk-based methodologies.
So, standing on the shoulders of giants, because that's what it is. When you read things, I think the first thing you do is look outside our industry as a whole. Right? Look for parallels, look for other examples, look at what's done in our industry. Like, you know, I'm a big fan. When I came to Gilead 8 years ago, one of the things that we brought with us was system level risk. The notion of that the system itself have a level of risk. And this comes from, you know, the RAMP model. I can't remember the exact authors, but it's published in the DIA journal many years ago. And it's a great article. Because what it does is it says like, hey, it builds a framework where you assign risks to the records. And so like a GXP low, so a GCP low is the same as a GMP low, that's right, same as a GLP low. And same thing for the high. So those risks, you assign everything into buckets, and the methodology starts getting applied. It looks at what is basically establishing what is the nature of that record. So that's high, medium, low. What do you do with the record? Right? Do you just create it? Do you create it? Do you edit it? Do you manipulate it? Or do you just report on it? So consider this: if you have something as a safety, if you're going to create the records in safety and management, that's very different than a viewer that comes in and just views the safety records, right? So it looks at that. Then it looks at the nature of the manufacturer, like, hey, are they pharma? Are they non-pharma? And then you can like overlap it and look at GAMP categories and other things like this, where you say, and GAMP is a surrogate, numbers are a surrogate for complexity. Category 5, right? The bigger the number is a more complex implementation, right? Because here you're saying, hey, it's custom bespoke versus say a 3 out of the box, right? So it's that level. So you can kind of cross all this and you come with what is the system over. So at the highest level, you look at a system and say, like, this is a low risk system, so therefore we should just do these activities just from the very get-go. Because if the business process itself is low, why go that extra, right? So looking at that is the biggest. And then you start looking at, like, personally with risk, I like to have the fluidity where it adds value. So you can look at whatever level is necessary. For example, if you're looking just at the requirements level and everything's, things are coming up very skewed high, or inherently you feel it should be lower, maybe you break that requirement down to its functional requirements, and you'll find out, like, hey, this one requirement has got 10 functional requirements underneath it. And of those 10 functional requirements, only one is high. So then you would change the way you do your risk assessment and say, like, hey, okay, for this one, we're going to break it out and we're going to isolate the area that's skewing it. For that one area that's high, we're going to do increased testing. And for the other areas, we'll do reduced. So it's kind of like looking at things, systems, but that goes back to, again, understanding the concepts, understanding the principles, such that you can calibrate. If you're going to try to build a one size fits all and like shut off your brain, you're never going to get there. And I think that in the collaboration with GAMP was one of the key things that came out, that there was a certain amount of frustration that people weren't applying that critical thinking, that they were looking at a GAMP and blindly applying these 3x3 tables as, like, as words from above, and saying that it must follow this and therefore we must do this, as opposed to looking at this and understanding, right? It's a very interesting thing. Why I love the partnership with GAMP recently is, we took a case study and we did it 2 different ways. And one of the things that you always see is everyone, when you have a case study, everyone is like, that's the only way we could do it because it's over there. And it's like, no, it was never intended for that. These examples, even if it's in a guidance doc, it's just an example, right? You should take that moment back and, do it your way and think about what is the value, right? And then reading to understand and then abstracting those risk methodologies out. If you look at suppliers, and let's pivot. We'll go to Annex 11, right? Annex 11 talks about, hey, you should, in Section 3, it talks about you should have written agreements between, you and your suppliers. Yes. And then IT should be treated analogously. Well, you apply critical thinking, it's like, well, hey, IT is just a supplier. So I can leverage the activities that my supplier does. I'm not QA over my supplier. I can build in the infrastructure. In internal IT audit, functions get audited more. You usually, like, I get audited, like, what? We get two quality units auditing us. So we have regular routine audits of more than my suppliers get. And even my suppliers consider, like, Microsoft's like, no, we're not going to let you through the door. And yet, where you have less visibility, you take more risk. You're like, oh, okay, well, they're a big company, so with no basis. And for your internal IT company where you have that basis, like, oh, no, you need to do this, you need to do that. And this is where we start, the others are able to innovate and move things forward. And over here, we start putting ourselves in a rate limiting factor where we just think purely on the inspection, purely on doing it the way that I've done it before. And we don't think about the principles and what was the intent, right? So there we get stuck in this loop. So the risk management about a long route to get there. What I would do is, avoid the one size fits all, look at principles versus practices, I would look actually outside of our centers. One of the things that I like to do is I like to read. I'll go look at like Nancy, I think it's Levison. She writes these books on like safety systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I was having a conversation with someone, and when it's like, well, those that data is just for large systems. So 40 million lines of code is not a large system.
Right.
I was like,
Right.
can we not take the parallels? Are we saying that this is, it's a large system? Sure, it's, maybe it's like a building, it's something else, but, it's analogous. It's got modules, it's got, it's got components in it. I've got pipes that are complex are going through and pumps. I said, well, I've got lines of codes with ifs and branches.
Yeah, and
so
there's lessons to take away from that, right? So from outside of our industry, for sure. Even if it's not exactly, the same, there's still lessons there. So I think we all should need to do that a little bit more in this industry, to be honest. So in follow up to what you've just said, I want you to talk a little bit more about testing, because we always have a lot of questions about that. And so does this risk-based critical thinking impact our processes for performing the testing and documenting evidence of testing and the process for handling testing failures?
Yeah, so definitely it does. If you look at CSA, right, one way of looking at it is, we have risk-based testing because you can't test everything. And and then CSA analogy would be risk-based documentation, right? Because quality is more important than that screenshot, than that documentation, just for inspection purposes. So CSA introduces, concepts where, if in the most basic form, it's like an affidavit type, right? When you have an ad hoc test case, or you have an unscripted test case, in both of those scenarios, and let's talk about ad hoc. And I'm using the CSA definitions because if you look at software engineering, it's kind of a little broader. But if you just look at ad hoc testing, what they're saying is like, you use this to test the lows. Number one, they're low anyway. And you would sit there and you say, tell me when it doesn't work. And some people have a problem with that, but I kind of sit there, it's like, well, when you apply your risk-based testing approach, what do you do for the lows? You either say you're going to test them indirectly, or you don't even bother testing them because you say, like, I accept them the way they are. What they're saying is like, hey, that's, why you would do that is because you're focused on the documentation burden. This gives you the avenue. It's like, hey, quality is more important. If you have ability, why don't you go at it? We're not saying do it. Make sure, at least from a sanity perspective, you're okay with it, that you don't have that blind spot. So go for it. Again, quality more important than
right.
And that. Then at that higher level in the model, they have the unscripted testing, which is a broad term because there's many, many different methodologies in there. But there, you're looking at it, and the simplest way to look at it is say, hey, it's a series of ad hoc testing. Right? It's affidavit based. It's saying like, I did it, right? And it is, and then show me when it doesn't work. But you put the areas that you're going to look at, explicitly call them out, right? So you're going to say for that printer example, that the printer speed, verify printer speed, printer quality, right? You would put out these particular areas rather than saying, hey, the printer was okay. These, the quality of the printer is critical for my processes. That speed is critical for my processes. That you would put the attributes that are critical and you would call them out explicitly. But from a scripting, from an evidence perspective, it's only show me when it doesn't work. Now, some people have a problem with that methodology, but I'll sit there and say clinical trials, and I look at gender. I said, they don't take a picture of me, say, hey, Ken's a male, let me take a picture. Snap, right? Manufacturing, if I write down what the pH is, I write down what the pH is. I don't take a picture of the screenshot,
Right.
of the display and the pH meter, right? So there's this whole paradigm, right? Blood pressure, right? That can, we just measure it. When they're like, oh, no, I got to take a picture of that. And it's this notion where all of a sudden, because it's not, no, you can't, because we must have a screenshot. It's like, well, what was the intent of the screenshot?
Right.
Is it not enough that someone said that they did it and you have that accountability? And, you know, I grew up in manufacturing, and I always have this GMP manufacturing. I had this hypothesis when I came to validation. I said, this must be what some IT guy thinks happens in the GMP space. So they put all these rituals that far exceeded what we would do in manufacturing, which has direct impact, which is the product itself.
Right, for sure.
Oh.
How can we use these same critical thinking skills to assess then the root causes for failure? So you're talking about doing the testing and tell me if it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, right, how do we identify the root cause and then develop use cases to improve the quality of the system implementation and operation?
You know, I think the biggest thing, I think we have a lot of tools already to do, say, root cause analysis. We have Fishbone, right? You know, Kepner and Trigo is not, you know, but could be, and all these different frameworks that kind of get there. But, you know, the tools are only as good as the people using them. And the area that I always find fascinating, it was, I think it was Annie Duke, and it was I think it was her book, Thinking in Bets. And, you know, they introduced the concept of resulting. And it's where where you judge, you know, a decision based on the results alone. So she was talking about in poker, right? You know, you play the hand based on the probability.
Right.
And just because the probability going in your favor doesn't mean your decision was wrong. It's like kind of like saying, you know, I think she used an analogy of driving drunk. Just because you got home doesn't mean that was a good decision.
Right.
When you drove drunk, right? So
right.
It's that notion of result that is endemic in pharma, right? You do a risk-based approach. Oh, we got a miss. Our approach was wrong. Let's, you know, we can't do that risk-based approach. You know, it's like, hold on, you know, in your risk-based approach, you know, severity versus probability, you already have it. And probability is such a wild guess in our sector, to be honest. Like, what's the probability that function is going to fail? How do you really know that?
Right.
Right. That's why we look for surrogate number methodologies, right? Such as complexity of implementation and other surrogate things where we can kind of wrap our head around to kind of get a more meaningful number. But that in itself, right, when you implement a new methodology, we did something like for one of our projects, and then issues made it to production. And the first thing, well, see, that's because we use this new methodology. And we're like, hold on, let's do the root cause analysis.
Right.
And the root cause analysis was something completely different. But the fascinating thing is the people who forget, it's like, oh, that went bad because we did this new methodology. And it's like, no. So the tools are there. It's actually the people side that kind of needs to be calibrated, right? Every tool, if you come with a bias,
right,
is that inherent bias kind of comes in, and it's looking at it and understanding what does it mean when you take a risk-based approach, and going back to principles, that there is an element of probability, and it can go one way or the other. And if it goes, everyone always thinks about the savings and everything else. Like, you should take a moment and say, like, flip side, are you really okay if this goes off? And then I personally don't believe that, hey, if a risk-based area, like if it's an area where I exclude and an issue happens, I said, I was not a deviation, right? We already accepted the fact up front that this was going to happen. And so it's a fascinating concept where you don't establish and you go, again, you get in the resulting, you only focus on one side. You take the step back, you avoid the resulting, focus on the principles, and look at both sides of the coin, as opposed to just looking at what you want to see.
Right. A much clearer picture that way.
Yeah.
So thinking about documentation, and you're talking about, you know, unnecessarily collecting screenshots and other, you know, things that we do in industry, which are maybe not necessarily the right way. So can you talk about, you know, this risk-based approach to documentation and provide a little guidance for our audience on the best ways to do this?
Sure. So number one thing, right, is when you're looking at that is identifying areas where you need it, where there's a value, right?
Right.
So, you know, like for most things in life, you know, if you eliminate the edge cases, I mean, the extremes, and then you got the middle. The middle, of course, is typically the more area where you have to have more thinking involved. Because, you know, like, well, that's high risk.
Right.
that's low risk, or that, yeah, that's a good car, that's a bad car, right? You kind of intrinsically can recognize,
The
like
extreme, the outliers. Yeah.
and it's the middle where you start looking, and that's where you start having to put structure in. But first, you just said, let's getting rid of that. If it's low, then we're saying like, hey, affidavit's enough, because then inevitably most people would risk assist it away. Hey, we hit that indirectly.
Right.
Right. So the trace matrix will go here. We tested that indirectly. We don't have an explicit test case for that. How is that different than the CSA notion of ad hoc? Except they're saying like, well, you should actually probably try them.
Yeah.
In addition, right, and outside of the system, because why we risk this away is because we don't want to create the test cases for it, because it's going to be too much work, and then we're going to get protocol generation errors, protocol execution errors, and I've got to, and this whole notion of evidence unnecessary. CSA gives you that opportunity like, hey, let's calibrate that, let's get away from that. Now, again, back to that earlier example, we were talking about that notion of affidavit. There are two different ways you can do it. Because you don't want to actually come there and give your quality partner a stack and say like, hey, it's all good. You need to have some like, in the middle, you should have some guardrails.
Right.
And you can sit there and go like, hey, in exploratory testing from the software engineering practice, they have this notion of a test charter. These are the areas we're going to hit. And you can go to your quality partner and say like, hey, these are the areas you hit. Are these okay? Are you in agreement? If you're going to bring in quality, because, frankly, I run a separate test cycle. We'll go to that later. But you can say, is this scope okay? Are you doing it? The other way you could do it is when you're doing exploratory, you could create a law. These are the scenarios I covered. Right? Or these are the scenarios this is the charter I intended, and this is what I actually did. I did more because the whole notion of exploratory is you explore the application, right? You learn the system, you play, it's a mini plan, do, check, act. Where you do it, you plan it, you do, you check, act. It's like, oh yeah, explore that. Let me try this, let me try that. But you time bound it and you get the results. If you have a log from that, then you're able to say like, hey, these are the things I covered, and you can say, like, okay, we're good with that. Right? So there's different levels of rigor. It really starts depending on your organization and what your organization's used to. And what in fact people like to go is they say there are many ways to prove something was done. You can go to the audit trail and show that, hey, this testing was done. You can demonstrate in the system like, hey, it works. Right? Our methodology, our life cycle works. I could show you right now. We can go in the valve environment. You want to see in the production environment? I can show you that functionality is working.
Right.
So that whole notion that I must have that screenshot, and then the fallacy is like, well, we need it because we have to defend it. And I said, well, when does that actually come up? Right? During an inspection, they don't say, show me the validation document. They say, show me the system. Show me where you approve this particular lot. If they're looking at this, show me the valve plan. Yeah, it looks like you did it. Show me a couple of deviations and whatnot. But if the system's okay, right, and especially in the US, right, if you're looking at enforcement discretion, from scope and application, and even scope and application very narrowly interprets it, right? It's like basically down to, map it to the predicate rules. It's a narrow interpretation. We've done this very broad interpretation where we pull in multiple systems. But back to the question, right? So we kind of talked about that ad hoc and that unscripted. What I'm actually a big advocate of is, when I get into Gilead, one of the things, and we introduced this actually when I was in the CRO in a past life, is the notion of testing we called it like our SQA cycle or system test cycle, where you actually test it not for regulated purposes, testing to make sure that it actually works, from a software testing perspective. And you go out and you test it in the scenarios and you come up with the issues. The benefit that we started doing on top of that was say, okay, the valve cycle can review what was done there, look at it and say like, yes, rather than repeating it, confirming like, yeah, we did this, this, and this.
Right.
And we're covered. And that's one evolution. The ultimate evolution that I always like is it's a life cycle. Because I did this activity, because I did this testing, there's no separation, there's no distinctions between valve and that test cycle. It's just the fact that we did it should be enough. But that's kind of like the ultimate target where you want to be. Because that used to be the process. Did you follow your life cycle? At the end of the day, when it exits the life cycle, it's done, as opposed to saying like valve is just testing. Valve is actually the whole life cycle, ensuring that. And quality should be like, hey, that these gates were followed and done. So
Yeah. I think I'm just thinking about what you're saying, and it's so true. And I think a lot of times with the screenshots and all the extra documentation, they're trying to prove compliance, or they're trying to convince the regulators that they've done everything correctly, so there's nothing to see here. But what you're saying is when your system's working the way it's supposed to be, when everything in your life cycle is working well, that also proves that you've done everything the way you're supposed to, right?
Yes, and it's somewhere in between, but yes, essentially yes, and it is the refocus, and then CSA again puts that narrow layer. If it's critical, you probably want to do it, and it's not just because you want to do it for inspection purposes.
Right.
You want to have that documentation for your needs,
and it's important to the quality of the product, right? And to the process. So
like it establishes a baseline. I go to a lot of testing conferences. You go like Star West, Star East, you go to STP, you go to test. If you ask them, hey, do you take screenshots for passes? I'm like, no. Are you crazy? Well, we only take it because when there's a value is when an issue happens. Except, I did run into these people from a bank, and they said like, well, hey, there's some areas where we do because it establishes a baseline, and we want to be able to go back to that baseline. So there is a point, there's a value. Actually, NGAMP says that, right? Unnecessary screenshots that don't have value should be avoided.
Right.
So it's all there. It's a matter of, again, not just going to the method, to M3, looking at the risk tables 3x3 and blindly applying that, and blindly saying I must have a screenshot, is reading the entire document and understanding, well, when should I take a screenshot? When should I do this table? Does this table apply all the time? That the table is, you should think of it almost guidance, because you can do more or less. And one of the conversations that came out of GAMP and the whole conversation that impacts documentation is, CSA was talking about like, hey, a level of rigor that kind of went up with risk. For the biggest risk areas, I should have robustly scripted test cases. But then in the conversation with the experts again, we're going like, even for a high risk area, I can take that with a series of unscripted testing, right? Because if I say the high, back to that printer, if I cover all the use cases that I need to cover, right? That the speed is okay, that the clarity is okay, the quality of the printing is okay, the number of inputs, if I cover all the things I need to, it's like, when I do that by affidavit, is that not enough? Doesn't that, and they're like, yeah. So there was this whole notion that, you would need more of it, but you could still, cover it. And it's not about like, hey, shut off your brain, go to a 3x3 table and like map, yep, 1, 2, yep, it's here. And that is the whole notion of critical thinking, is being able to understand the principles and adjust as you go, and make sure whatever you do, that it's value added.
Right.
Everyone recognizes it, because what a lot of people goes like, well, yeah, we know the system's good, but we got to go through this paperwork. And, and it's just a fascinating thing, or they'll avoid it. So, well, we got this tool that can do 100% verification, but, it's too much work to qualify that tool. So we're just gonna, just review a couple records, with some table 10%, square root of n plus 1, or some formal AQL. It's like, but you can do 100%.
Yeah.
And they'll bypass. And then you start thinking, well, what was better for patient safety, product quality? And if you look at part 11 and where CSA is going, right, they're saying, going like, hey, part 11, scope and application, if it, part 11 applies when it has a direct, it's, based on a predicate rule. That tool that does the verification that supports your validation is not a predicated record.
Right.
It is something that's used, no different than at that point in time. It's they're saying like, well, hey, then you're going back down to the extreme ends where it's the ever-ending scope, right? Where part of the scope and application was like, you're doing broad interpretations, you're going way beyond, and you're pulling in too many systems, right? That prevents, the adoption of technology without the betterment to public health. CSA is again saying the same thing. You want to go to other areas, you look at Annex 11. Annex 11 will sit there and they'll say like, hey, applications should be validated, infrastructure should be qualified. And if you go read it, it goes down to, there's like automated testing. There should be a documented assessment. It didn't say like, hey, automated testing is infrastructure, so therefore it must be qualified. automations and application therefore must be validated. No, they said like you should have a documented assessment, which is already acknowledging that it is in a different class, right? That, hey, you should do something. You should make sure it works. And the whole notion with this is like making sure that you use things. You should be embracing technology, right? Because this is where we're at. And the reality is when we don't embrace it as an industry, then we end up having issues. And then we go to software as a service provider. You know what they're doing? They're using those tools.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's almost like yeah, let me put my head in the ground like the ostrich, pull my head back into the turtle shell.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll see some of that thinking. Some of the shift in thinking we'll see as some of these younger professionals start to make their way further up the food chain, because they've grown up with all of these technologies and they're expecting these technologies, as opposed to some of us who had to get introduced to them along the way, right? Exactly. A floppy.
5 1/4 floppy.
Yeah, what are you doing with that?
Someone sent it to me. So
too funny. I used to have those. I've long since gotten rid of them.
That one's for decoration, but if I show that my daughter, she'll have no idea.
So Ken, some would say that we're really moving away from the standard V model of CSV activities and going toward this more agile type of validation. So my question to you is, does this intentionally align well with the agile method for software development?
So I don't think there's necessarily an intentionality like that they explicitly targeted it, but it is a byproduct and is related. I think that the intentionality was opening the door to modern approaches, right? So instead of basing software engineering practices from 1993 and a half, and there's a book, I think it was Glass Software Perspectives from like 84 or something. If you read that, it'll capture the thinking of that day. It's a fascinating book. But if you go to Agile itself, right? Agile, embraces the tooling, right? Embraces the speed, the flexibility, things that, validation traditionally doesn't have. And then the quality of those systems, right? What CSA and the critical thinking associated with CSA opens the door to modernization, Agile being one of the areas where you can use it. I was reading an upcoming document, doing an industry peer review that had great stuff on Agile. I liked it. It was talking about like, hey, we shouldn't be looking for paper for the record. We should be looking at the systems. That these tools can be the actual source repositories for these records. And so there was some progressive thinking. My comments were, I was like, you should go a little further. Because, I thought you're 80%, you're 90%. You should clarify that last little bit and go that extra mile. But I think it was great work. I think, the fact that I was even peer reviewing that is an indication that the industry is pivoting, that the industry is recognizing that the practices that you go like, let's say, major corporate, I'll just go out and say it, maybe I'll get in trouble, but like Google, you look at Google, but actually it's in one of their books on how Google tests software. You read the entire book and you get to the end, it's like, yeah, by the way, we don't have testers anymore, right? And, they don't have testers. You look at
because everybody's testing. Is that the job of everyone in the company, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's that shift, right? That's there. You look at the training, and there was this whole notion of trust, right? That you trust the people. I mean, you go to the political science. Francis Fukuyama has this concept of trust, right? You have a shared objective kind of definition of trust, and with that, within an organization, there should be trust.
Right,
like,
of course.
I actually, don't fear like the auditor or anything else. That's a CAPA. That's a write-up. Those paychecks don't go out. The books are wrong. I make a financial mistake. I do a SOX thing. Then there goes my job, right? I mean, that's if you're looking from a pure risk perspective, but from a trust perspective, right? It's like we inherently for the org, like our internal orgs who are doing this, we should have more trust, right? Yet we give that trust where we don't have the visibility. So you go to the software as a service where you don't have the ability to see what's going on. Like internally, I'm going like, hey, look at everything I do. If you have a question, come look, we're an open book. Look at any record you want. No, it needs to be this way, and I need a screenshot. It's like, how come? Yeah, over here where you can't access it and you can't see it, and you shouldn't really have that trust because there's not a shared interest. Because I'm like, hey, go Gilead, let's go. I need that stock to go up.
Yeah.
They don't have that same level, and yet we trust them more.
Right.
Right, where it's difficult to see where we should actually have less trust. We trust them more in the val cycle. Yeah, they're a good company. Well, you know what? We'll just do a PQ. And it's that fascinating concept where we've gone to this ritual, and that's driven by compliance. Right? That's when you put the compliance mindset in front and like, hey, I want a paperwork, something that a story to tell. Right. As opposed to, hey, let me have it. This is our process, and let me walk you through this new process. They want to make it look like it's always looked, which is why as I alluded earlier, or stated earlier, the feedback mechanism. You go from practitioner to quality over, and you do it the same way because I'm comfortable and I don't have to explain it. And anytime you could, and it's difficult. And to move it forward, it does require a certain amount of collaboration. Like, Senthil was with me last time I was speaking. We had a great synergy because he was QA and I was, quality engineering, over validation. So we had a great partnership. And the interesting thing about that, in a past life, I used to be what was known as compliance. So compliance sat above quality. And we would actually interpret guidance and interpret regulation, and we would actually audit what quality did. So I used to audit Senthil. So we always had there was a high degree of trust because he knew that I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do anything that will get us in trouble.
Right.
Because he knew that that was my background. My background was the same as his background.
Yeah, and that's just making you better. It's a stronger team. Right. Ken, do you have any thoughts on developing critical thinking, risk-based skills for teams? As it's a culture shift as much as a procedural change, how can you train your teams for that?
Yeah, and that's where I think you need to challenge. Get people to look at reference models, get people to understand, read other books, look. Most of the thinking in there and focusing on principles. If you just, the one thing to walk away, like focus on principles. If you understand the principles, everything flows naturally. It's actually, to the people like, say, I follow GAMP, it's like, well, have you really read it? And I've been in meetings where, people who should know, I was like, yeah, the GAMP guy says this. I'm like, really? I'm like, oh, God. It is about reading and not just looking at the method, not going to and frankly, it's hard. So you got to allocate time. And even for my team, I used to tell them, I said, like, I don't want you to go to another validation conference. Go to a testing conference, learn something new, learn something modern, and see what you can pull back. Right. And then but there's a certain degree, and the problem is at a different way is, like any manager, you stratify your workforce. There are people who are always going to do the status quo, people, life, they have different priorities and they're going to do it. So you need to stratify. You need to find and cultivate your leaders. Like I've got a guy underneath me named Vincent who's worked with me at 3 different companies, and he's my rock star. My job is just to keep him happy. And he will go out and he will explore and he will understand and he will bring back different things and he will propose different things and we'll have fascinating conversations. And that's where it's like, and I always tell my team, I said, like, yeah, I'd much rather have you guys tell me I'm crazy than someone else, or much rather have you say that I'm wrong. And so
you want your team to find the mistakes or whatever before someone else does outside.
So to do that creates a culture, but to also do that, you question them, and they need to be comfortable with being questioned as well. Mm-hmm. And then you got to come back and you got to prop them back. It's like, okay, if you push someone down and you keep pushing, they'll break. So you got to prop them out. So it's kind of like management 101. Is, right. How do you, because critical thinking is a broad concept where you apply it throughout your entire life. But again, focusing on the principles, getting people to understand the principles, and challenging people to read Making them go, like, look at a class on strategic thinking. I had people taking that. It's like, hey, what you're doing is, just cookie cutter. I need you to think one level more abstractly, or make them come up with models, right? Give them something that they can own, and you can see the weaknesses and strengths that they have, and develop them. But critical thinking, like, again, it's always going back to principles. Do you understand why something was done, what the thinking was? And it's, and the fascinating concept, people seem to, they jump to conclusion. Right? They jump to conclusion, and they talk in terms of conclusion. There was a great thing that one of my old bosses gave me at Devin Krishnamurti. He's a great guy, but it was a ladder of inference. And it was talking about how conflicts occur at the conclusion level. Right? People are arguing at the conclusion. If you're butting heads, you need to look at, what was the logic that was used to get to that conclusion. If their conclusions are sound and their logic is sound, then look at the data. So what you need to do is you need to apply a methodology, right? So, don't argue at conclusions, because you're not going to get there. Then check each other's logic. Is the logic sound? Then check each other's data, right? If you're looking, if I'm looking at this and you're looking at this, we're going to have different results, even applying the same logic. And then that's a way of thinking. So there's different ways to do it. But if you look at the principles and seek to understand versus seeking to refute, you'll get there.
Great idea, and some tactics for our listeners for really just developing their teams. I guess not only critical thinking skills, but just really getting them to think beyond, always thinking a little bit higher, a little bit further outside of the box. And I think that's important. Yeah. So Ken, as we wrap up today, I just want to give you an opportunity to share any last thoughts or takeaways with our listeners.
Sure. Again, principles over practices. Right? That's you. Clearly, that's the tagline.
That's the takeaway for today, for sure.
Yeah. That you do it, and then if you're unhappy with the process, you need to think about instead of stuck in the victim loop, thinking this is so onerous, how can you make it better? Or what can you do? What can you as a person do that would change this, right? And make a difference. The other thing, hire people smarter than yourselves, right? It encourages, that growth, that dissension, or not dissension, that knowledge. It says there's a synergy.
Right. Right.
And we need to, as an industry, you're either, it's kind of like Darwin, right? You got to evolve. If you don't evolve, you're not going to get there, right? The world is changing right now. Right. CSA, is here, and and again, it's bringing refocus to things that we've already done. But if you don't move with it, you as an organization, well, you're pretty much limiting your own career, right? You're not going to move, right? If you only know one thing and you don't learn the new and the latest, right? About, if you look at the tech sector, and we should be the same, and, it's like, it's not about years of experience. It's what new technologies and new approaches do you know, right? It's always about getting to the next, about being relevant. Doing the same thing again and again will never get you there. And, you look at technology as obsoleting roles, right? That, we used to have people who had toll collectors. They're no longer there. You have people doing the checkout side. They're no longer there. The technology will keep moving, right? We're looking at automation in testing, right? You're looking at different ways to get things there. So you want to be looking forward and moving forward and thinking about abstractly, hey, how do I apply this? Right. And I think that is the takeaway. Again, principles versus practice, and even that statement, right, from Harrington Emerson. Guy was born in 1853. Right. So we're not talking about something new, but that's so classic.
Right.
In the thinking that it needs to be there. And the other takeaway is in this push to go automate everything. I've had vendors come up to me and say, like, hey, we have this solution that automates everything. It does this. And I was like kind of looking at them, and I was like, wow. I said, but why would I test that? I said, that's such low level functionality. If I can't accept that works, then we shouldn't even be on this platform. So you're asking me to pay for money to automate something that has no value.
Right.
And that's something where that critical thinking comes into play. It's not just like, hey, this is a quick and easy, but like, hey, do I really need that?
Yeah.
What is the value? So the takeaway is, and especially the problem right now is everyone's coming out of the woodwork and saying like, hey, we've got this, we've got that, and they're rebranding stuff that they've already been doing. It's taking that step back. It's like, what are they doing? And looking from principles versus practices such that, you yourself grow, such that you and your role in the organization, grow, such that your company grows. So, that you have that time and that ability to take care of what matters most, especially with COVID, family.
Yeah.
Right?
We'll end it there, Ken. Those are some great takeaways for today. And I want to leave our listeners with those thoughts because I'm sure we can keep having this conversation, and we will keep having this conversation for many months and years to come. But I think you have provided some great insights and real clarity to this concept of risk-based critical thinking. And hopefully everyone will pull some nuggets out of today's discussion that they can quickly start to implement with their teams. So thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely.
The challenge is keeping me quiet, but
yeah,
hey.
No, it was great. I love listening to you talk about these topics. So I really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again to Ken Shitamoto for being our guest today. We really appreciate the insights and accounts on this topic. Also want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. Most importantly, I'm sending out my thanks to you, our valued listeners. I appreciate your time each week, as well as your help in sharing this podcast. Together, we can continue to spread the word. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and be sure to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick note or leave an online review. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another informative and timely discussion. Until then, make it a great week.